I'm Scott O'Malonic, editor-in-chief of Inc. And next up at the Vision Conference, we have someone who's been part of my mornings for longer than I can remember. First, as a host at MSNBC, then at the Weekend Today Show, then the Today Show itself, culminating in CNN this morning. Now, an entrepreneur, owner of Soledad O'Brien Productions, host of Matter of Fact, the weekly public affairs program, and a prolific tweeter to 1.3 million people. Soledad O'Brien, welcome to the Inc. Vision Conference. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. I'm exhausted just hearing that. Yes. It's funny. I was thinking the same thing, how much we've moved from watching morning television, right, to getting up in the morning and hopping on Twitter and kind of see where the stories have moved every day. It's nice to see you. Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure, and I know our audience is looking forward to hearing from you as well. And I think that's an interesting point you start at is sort of how we've changed in our consumption of news. But you've changed quite a bit too, right? You have an evolution of your own. First as someone who once worked for what was the world's largest media company, and then going off to Soledad O'Brien Productions on your own. What was the impetus for that?
I think it was a long time in coming, and I really loved working for large media companies because I think I learned a ton about the industry and understanding just storytelling, basically how to work in a big environment, how to leverage sort of different parts of the corporate environment to get done what you need to get done. So it was very valuable. But when it came to a couple of things, one, the kind of stories that I wanted to do, and two, working in an environment where people didn't necessarily have the same vision that I had for what I could do. That to me was the impetus for becoming an entrepreneur. And it really started a couple of years before it started. Like I had the name of the company while I was still working at that time at CNN. But yeah, I think what happens as you go along and you build a brand and you kind of create value in your own name and the quality of the work you do, when you start realizing like, hey, I'm going this way and they're going this way, and maybe it's not a great fit anymore. Or maybe the fit can be every so often we come together to work on projects, but being a full-time employee is not necessary. And I think that's a big shift that a lot of us have seen, that there's a different model for how it has to be. There was a time when everybody worked, your negotiation, right, was they want you to do this show at this time for this money with this many weeks of vacation. Now, I know in negotiations, everything is up for grabs. Like, what do you want out of that relationship is really what you're negotiating. What kind of a partnership do you need to have? And if there's a good fit because you like the people or you find an area of overlap in the work, then I think you can really create a lot of interesting partnerships. And that's what we've tried to do at Soledad O'Brien Productions.
And that's really what it is now is about partnerships. And I do want to speak to sort of your direction and the direction of places you worked at. But first, I'd like to address this idea of when you go out on your own, when you have your own place, it's all very exciting, and then suddenly you're responsible.
Yeah, I was going to say,
responsible for everything.
Exciting is not the first word I would have come up with. Terrifying, exhausting. And really confusing. I mean, I was a TV anchor and reporter. I traveled around the globe, literally, telling stories, and I was good at it, and I'm still good at it. But that's not the skills you need to run a company, sadly. Reading off a teleprompter does not help you very much with figuring out a budget and how to hire people, et cetera, et cetera. And so the learning curve was incredibly steep. And that awful feeling that you have when you join a company, and the first day you're not even sure where the bathroom is, that feeling of like, oh, I hate being the new person. I found as an entrepreneur that lasted a long time. It took me about a year and a half before I didn't feel like I'm not sure I know what I'm doing. And getting past that took a long time and really was not an enjoyable experience for me.
I think that's something a lot of our audience can sympathize with, certainly. What were you good at and what weren't you so good at when you started?
Yeah, I'm good at stories. I love storytelling. I'm good at delivering content. I can do the work. I can figure out the story, I can write the story, I can shoot the story, I can tell the story in every kind of format that you'd ever want. What I was not good at was how do you think about a budget? I'd never done a budget. How do you think about how you're going to structure your company? I remember walking into this space. This is my office. We've obviously been shut down because of coronavirus. And someone said to me, well, how many square feet do you need? And all my stuff was on my dining room table. And I'm like, I have no idea. I mean, I have no idea. And that would be, funny and amusing if you actually needed to know that before you could think about your real estate investment and how much space you need in an office. And that, of course, correlates to how many computers I would need to order and what's my editing system going to be and how are we actually going to have our delivery of all the different projects. And what would the verticals of our company be? Like all of those things were a process of figuring out. And actually, once I got past a year and a half, a very interesting process because I found I was good at some of these things that I didn't even realize I had the skills. And that's a great feeling to be like, wow, I'm great at negotiating. Who knew? But the first year and a half was really, really challenging. And I wish I'd taken an accounting class because the idea of building a budget was something I had never, ever done. And I had to learn that. And when you make mistakes on that front with your own money, you learn incredibly quickly how to do it the right way.
Sure. And, I'm reminded of some of our audience who sort of pour their life savings into their businesses, who have their mortgages and families riding on their success, and it's up to them. And that is an enormous burden. Were there particular ways you solved for some of the things you didn't understand or took longer time to come to understand?
Yeah, I got very good at asking for advice. I could get a lot of people on the phone, but I really found that I needed to talk to people who ran businesses, and some big businesses, some small businesses. Right now we have 13 full-time employees who are now all working remotely. But just sitting down with people, and I was amazed at the number of entrepreneurs and small business owners who would literally, back then we were going out for lunch, take out a napkin and draw a map for me of like, this is how I structure my company. My company was a little bit different than others because I'm both talent and also I'm an executive producer, so we do a lot of different things, but there are many similarities. I was struck by the generosity of people who would say, well, let me tell you what we do here, and here's how we structure it, here's how we think about billing, here are the mistakes we made. You don't need to make the mistakes that we made. That was amazing, and I leaned very hard into that. I wish I'd been braver about doing it earlier. I always like, I don't want to bother you. I wish I'd been like, I need to understand this, can you help? Because I finally got to that, and people were incredibly helpful, and I'm incredibly helpful now that we've sort of figured it out. I think that leaning on that was helpful. My husband works in finance, and so it was really useful to have somebody who had no dog in the fight beyond, I want you to be successful, and also get all the stuff off the dining room table, please, which was a mess. And I think he was very helpful with asking questions around, how are you thinking about your business? What do you want it to be? Not this year and next year, but 20 years from now. Walk me through what it looks like. And I think having someone who's just fully in your corner, but who understands basic finance was very helpful.
Sure, that's the ability to reach out to people, especially if there's one just sitting across the table from you, is useful. I think one of the great things about Inc. that we've seen, particularly with members of the Inc. 5000 and a group we call the Inc. Masters, which is a particularly special community, is their willingness to share that information. And you think at first it's all very cutthroat and everyone wants to beat everyone else, but once you're in that chair, I think you realize it's not necessarily a zero-sum game, that there's benefit from, as you talked about in the beginning, these sort of relationships, non-transactional relationships.
Yep, absolutely.
But all of that said, a certain level of confidence has to exist in one to, take the plunge into entrepreneurship, but even before that, for you to decide that you should be in front of the camera and that you had a story to tell and people should hear it from you. Where did that come from?
Yeah, I think it wasn't sort of this unbridled confidence as much as I started as a producer, and there came a point where I thought, well, shoot, I could just ask these questions. Even some of these dumb questions that I'm seeing people ask, like, I do that. I mean, my questions might be bad, but they're not as bad as that. And so I thought, like, I could do this, and that's really what put me in front of the camera. I was a producer at NBC News for a long time, working with an amazing correspondent named Bob Bazell. And he was wonderful, but sometimes he would take the story in the direction he wanted it to go, a little bit different than the direction I would have gone. And so I thought, really, if you want to leverage your own voice and your own power and have a say in where it's going, you kind of need to be the storyteller. You need to be your face and your voice. And even from being a correspondent to being an anchor, like if you want the tone of the show to be a certain thing as opposed to, well, I'm contributing to a bigger project, then you need to just do it. I don't know if it was confidence as much as maybe a little bit of frustration. Like, oh, I think it should go this way. Maybe stubbornness might be a better way to put it. In terms of running my company, it was a similar thing. It was, I think this could work. I think there are stories here that we could sell if we could figure it out, and leverage if we can figure it out, and that people would be interested if we can figure it out. I think we can do it. And I thought I had a big enough name in order to bring an audience along with me. And I think from that perspective, even years ago, when I was in my first reporting job in San Francisco in, what was that, 93, I remember trying to learn how to anchor. And the news director at the time said to me, we don't need any more female anchors. There are so many women here, they can all anchor, not for you. And I didn't really want to be an anchor, but I thought it would be a good skill to have. I've often focused on like my resume, do I have the skills that I need in my resume? And to have someone sort of say, like, we're stopping you here. I was like, oh, I knew I needed to leave that job. And that was a job I ended up leaving and going to MSNBC at the time, and then my career went on in big media companies. But I think I've always been pretty good at, if someone's not going to give you an opportunity to grow, you really need to rethink staying. It doesn't have to be I walk out the door and, dramatically. It can be, at the end of my contract, I probably had 2 more years on my deal there. When I stayed there, I gathered up all the information and the learning that I possibly could. And then when it was time to go, I could go. And I actually appreciate when people tell you where they see their vision for you, because it saves you a lot of time. Often people just lie to you. Oh my God, we definitely see this for you, and they don't mean it. And so when someone says, like, no, we do not think that you should be anchoring here, and that's a skill that you want to attain, then I think you're like, thank you for being straightforward. Now I need to leave, because I think I could do this, and at least I'd like to learn if I'm good at it. So I went to MSNBC to start anchoring, and that show was pretty successful. And then I was able to go back to New York and to anchor there, and anchoring gave me just a tremendous ability to kind of move up a level, if you will. And then when I moved into documentaries, it was the same thing. I wasn't sure I could do it, but by doing that, it really positioned me well to run a company. So I think you just have to be very sensitive to, if this person is stopping me and I think I can do it, then I got to go somewhere and figure out where I can do it.
It's an interesting thing, and I admire the people who've been told no and don't take that no for an answer and find a way forward. And I'm wondering, you come from a frightfully overachieving family, and your parents were sort of told no at a certain point as well. Did they serve as role models in that way?
Yeah, a lot of ways, and I think mostly because I think you can hear that story and it sounds dramatic. And I marched in and I said to him, I will be an anchor. And it didn't happen like that. He was very clear. I don't see this vision for you. And I was like, I kind of see it. Okay, well, I am going to start moving toward this thing that I think I can do. It was so gentle. It was not dramatic at all. And yes, my parents were an interracial couple in the late 1950s in Baltimore, Maryland, where interracial marriage was illegal. And so, in fact, the Supreme Court wouldn't overturn the ban on interracial marriage till 1967, which is when my little brother was born. So he was my parents' 6th child. And so I do think they had this attitude of, we're going to go and do the things that we want to do and not worry so much about other people weighing in on it. And I think it was very similar. They were not loud, big, here's what we're doing. I think it was much more of our goals are this. These people over here seem to be standing in the way of those goals. we want to get this done anyway. So that's kind of what I've tried to do. I think if you're trying to add to your resume, it doesn't have to be highly dramatic. I think you just have to check things off. Yep, I learned how to do this. Yep, I've had this relationship. Yep, I get it. Now, a year out from my contract ending, I knew what I needed to be looking for next. I had a lot of clarity about the next step versus feeling like, I don't know, what do I do?
So you had a sense of your and mentioned that you were developing a personal brand through your reporting and through the desire for anchoring. How would you have described that then, say 10 years ago or earlier, when you were behind an anchor desk, and how has that changed over time? Because you're at least, again, from the other side of the screen, it appears that you went through somewhat of a pivot.
I don't think so much of a pivot. I think my reputation was in being a little unflinching, especially in the documentaries we were doing. I think what made those docs really good was at the moment when that uncomfortable question had to be asked, I would lean in and ask it. Or when I would anchor, we were doing a lot of political coverage back in 2012. When the obvious question that might piss off the person you're interviewing had to be asked, I would not have fear about asking it. Now, the downside of that is that person might not come back on your air, right? You might make them mad, but if your job is to serve your audience, then you shouldn't care. It's a little bit like, it's why I'm so frustrated by access journalism, right? Is this idea that it's a constant quid pro quo back and forth, so you're never really gonna make anybody uncomfortable because you need them to come back again. And so, for me, I think today, it's a lot of that unflinchingness is, social media obviously is a completely different kettle of fish, as they say, but I think the unflinchingness stays the same, and I think in our documentaries, that's what makes a powerful documentary, is when you sit on a shot, when you sit in a scene and you don't turn away and you make people answer the difficult thing. I think that's good reporting and good journalism. So I don't know. I think that thread has always been there. I think that's kind of what my brand was, and I think that's kind of stayed the same.
Would the documentaries, for example, the In America series, how would they be different today? Because there's no question the idea, your social media following, we see a side of you that is far more outspoken than we did even when you were behind the desk, even if you were answering that occasional or asking that occasional difficult question. Would those documentaries be different now? Would you be different?
Yeah, in a lot of ways, those issues have not really changed, so I don't think so. We did a lot on policing, and I think it was like, did you know that policing is bad for some people? So maybe I would have been able to come at it from a standpoint where more people understood some of the issues we were talking about, as opposed to having to begin at the beginning for part of an audience that wasn't particularly educated. I think I'm more outspoken, certainly on social media, for two reasons. One, I think social media has kind of gone that way, so I look at it as a personal vehicle for opinion, and I don't think I had that. And also, number two, I think every single person who works for an organization should stick to that organization's social media policies. And so I would never have tweeted my opinion at a place where their policy said you can't tweet your opinion. Because if I worked for someone, obviously I would take that very seriously. And I tell that to young people all the time. If you've agreed to work with somebody, you've agreed to their social media policy. And if you don't follow it, then you're sort of showing your own sense of disregarding the rules, which I'm not a fan of. So I think a lot of it is really, I'm self-employed. I work for me. I get to have my opinion. I get to frame things as I want to. I get to ask the questions the way I want to. It's very, very freeing, certainly, in a lot of ways. There are challenges because you're constantly thinking about how do we partner to raise money and who should we be working with. But I have liked that part of it, certainly.
So you mentioned before that when you ask a tough question, you run the risk of someone not coming back on air for you. As an entrepreneur, offering an opinion can run the risk of losing a client, for example. how have you dealt with that? Have you given it any consideration at all, or issues more important to you than any particular client?
Yeah, no, I think actually if you give a client bad advice, if you assume that they're coming to you because they believe you have something to offer them, and you give them bad advice or you're not helping them see your point of view, I think you might lose that client anyway. Sometimes we would do documentaries and I'd say, you come to me because you want it done a certain way, and so you have to kind of leave us to do it. And usually that conversation really works out, because I think sometimes clients want to have a discussion about, like, we think it should all be. For example, I'll give you a great example. I was working on a project, and in this project, one of the volunteers would say, "Could you get a shot of the computers that were donated?" And we've all been there, right? Where someone has like so many cutaway shots of and I get it. She was trying to really help the people who'd given a bunch of kids laptops. That's not the way to do it, right? It's not authentic. It's not genuine. The people who were giving the laptops would not have wanted to be inserted, I am sure, in a not real way. I was like, listen, if the laptop is in the shot, then we'll do it. If it's not, then we won't. But I said to her, you don't actually want me to do this. It is not authentic, and people can sniff out a lack of authenticity. I get it. You want to say thank you to someone who donated laptops to a great cause. Strategize a way to do that. Do a funny screen grab, circle, 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 heart, Instagram. Oh my gosh, did you see the whatever. That's authentic. But I think often my conversations are around, what are you trying to get to? What are you really trying to do? And we can help you with that. But I'm not going to let you do something that's just not going to work. I think that's my job if someone's coming to me to help them create content.
I think we're going to cut that clip out and send that to all of Inc.'s advertising clients.
But it comes from a good place, though, right? Like it's not like they're trying to take over your job. I think they're just trying to figure out, I want to help X, I want to do this. And so it's just about giving advice on, a better way to do that actually will resonate more and not piss people off. They won't feel used, is to actually do this over here if that's what you're trying to do. And usually that works. I think people just don't know. They just don't know.
I think that's right, and it is that process of education, and I also think you're engaged right now in a broader education, right? And you're trying to, I think, bring people along with open eyes to a more progressive place or point of view. How do you balance where you think we should be as a society, the things you think are right for us and the people living here, and bringing someone along with you, versus the fear of sending them off into their own corner, radicalized or not listening at all?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I don't know that I take on that responsibility. I've tried to do a couple of things that I have learned from social media, which is if you elevate lies, you're not serving your public. You're not. If you quote something and it's just not true, if I sit here and say, listen, the moon is made of cheese, and you run that, this is a hypothetical, obviously, and you elevate that and you clip it and you post it, right? And it's just not true, you're not actually serving the people who rely on you for information. And so I think journalists have to really think about how they tell stories, because I think most journalists don't want to put out erroneous information or things that are just untrue. Or also, I think things that are complicated, I think you owe your audience an explanation. Here's how it works. This sounds contradictory, but let me walk you through. I think our biggest issue is that people just tune out because, they just don't think, they don't understand the story, or they just think it's this or this. Most stories are not black and white, right? They're complicated. So, for example, people will say, 19th Amendment, women got the right to vote. Not exactly. Most women, some women, and it's that little piece that's like, well, actually, and I try to be the actually person. Like, there's some context here you might be missing. And so, if you're going to do a whole thing on let's celebrate women getting the right to vote, which is an amazing thing to celebrate, let's make sure we're also giving people context so that they actually understand what they're really celebrating and who was left out of that conversation. that takes some doing. That to me is sort of the job and the role. And that's what I think is important and worthwhile figuring out versus just elevating misstatements and mistruths or half-truths.
So how do you think your former colleagues are doing in the game now?
You know, I'm not a big fan of how people have been covering the White House, and partly it's not fully their fault because people have been in campaign mode, right, for 4 years. That usually doesn't work. Usually it works like this: there's an election, there's an inauguration, and then after that you do. So it's infrastructure week. Let's check in with Bob at the White House. Bob, that's kind of, they don't lead the coverage on everything, and because all of this coverage. Everything for the last 4 years has been sort of shoved through the filter of politics, and specifically presidential politics. It's exhausting. But also I think the filter's a little bit off. Like, why would we want to give people information about a pandemic that's wrong? The president frequently says things we know that are just not true about coronavirus. I personally would not elevate things that are not true about the worst public health crisis we have had in this country in 100 years. Like, why would we do that? So I think there's a real problem in framing. It's a little bit like if everybody only has a hammer, then everything's a nail, right? If you're a political reporter, then everything becomes, what are the politics of this? As opposed to, how do we think about telling this story for our audience, back to the people we serve? It's been very helpful, excuse me, for our show, Matter of Fact, because we wanted to look at policy. And it was interesting. We actually, in a very fast news cycle, we pre-taped the show. So we had a problem because we pre-taped the show. It's going to air on a Sunday in the middle of the week. That's a bug. And we figured out how to turn that bug into a feature by saying, well, if we can't keep up with the "Good morning, I'm Soledad O'Brien, the president tweeted last night," we actually could say, everybody's talking about voter suppression. Let's walk you through slowly what it is, what it means, where it's happening. Are long lines an indication of that? Like, we get to give you context. Everyone else is over here doing froth, but we actually aren't going to have people yell at each other. We're going to walk you through the housing crisis. We're going to tell you the story of, for example, a guy, an American, who lives in Mexico because he can't afford an apartment in the US. And so he commutes from Mexico into San Diego every day for his job. He walks across a bridge. I mean, it's insane. But that takes time. That's a story that has to be unwound. You have to go to Mexico with a crew and tell that story. He doesn't speak Spanish, by the way. And so we look at stories that way, and we leaned into the thing that we thought could be our strength and not our weakness. We figured, let's talk to only experts. No, if you are a former congressman, you don't get to be an expert. Sorry, I don't care what you have to say, unless it's an interview about how you become a congressman. You're not an expert. I don't want to hear from you. If we're talking about science, you need to be at NASA. You need to be a scientist. You can disagree, but you need to be a scientist. And then also people have expertise in their lived experience. So we're not going to do a story on millennial voters without hearing from millennial voters. Regardless of what they have to say, they have this lived expertise. And so we started carving out kind of the ethos of the show by the things that we thought of at first as being problematic, but actually ended up being widely helpful. I think it really has helped us in the show doing very well. We're up to almost 2 million viewers in the height of the pandemic.
That's terrific, and that's your side of the story. What do you say to the audience, right? As someone who is in the media or has been at various times, I often my response is often, you get what you deserve. Your investment is your return when it comes to understanding issues in the news. What would you say to the folks who are consumed by social media platforms and the hot take, and how do you get them to more fully invest in the issues to have an understanding, not just a response?
Yes, but social media platforms actually do go beyond the hot take. I mean, you just have to decide you want to read them, So I actually think it's amazing to have the opportunity to dip into so many different conversations and really brilliant writing. And, on social media. You don't really have to ferret it out. I actually think, again, the onus is on the news organizations to provide for people not just the hot take, but also the explanatory take. Like, here, let us explain this complicated thing. I can't tell you the number of people I used to work with who'd say, well, politics is boring. And I'm like, well, politics is boring only if you make it boring. Like, it's not your audience's fault if they think politics is boring. It's your fault because you've made it boring. So go and figure out, politics is actually not boring if you look at a bunch of stories that have to do with politics that are not framed as politics. I think politics can be fascinating. Sure, if you're going to cover a horse race, you do need a lot of drama. You need this dropped, and is Biden answering questions, and when is the debate, is it going to happen or not? But if you actually look at a community that's trying to make change and figuring out how to do those things, you have some very interesting stories, but they're not framed as this person versus this person. They were trying to figure out how to solve this problem. Here's what they did. It's a different framing.
I want to be respectful of your time. We've had you for quite a bit. Just a couple more questions, and one would be, we joked a little bit before the cameras ran because I was not as enthusiastic about the day as I should have been. I lost sight of my North Star, right? What is your North Star that gets you up every morning and gets you to the office, whether that's the actual office or the dining room table, and get to work? What keeps you going?
Yeah, today the office is always the dining room table since we're all sort of basically on lockdown. It depends. Every day it's a little bit different. I have 4 kids, and so often just getting them going and keeping everybody on track and trying to make sure I think every mom and dad sort of monitors how everybody's doing psychologically, and we're in a tough time, I think, so certainly that's been a challenge. One thing that I have found very helpful that we did both at our family and in our staff, it's just so cheesy, but it's worth doing. We started doing this thing called Roses and Thorns. Do you know that game? Oh my gosh, it's the worst. Oh my gosh, it's so bad. It's so cheesy. You'll be mocked in your family if you do this. But they would do it at my kids' school, and everybody had to go around and talk about what their rose of the day is and what their thorn of the day is. And I found that 2 things happened. One, people would start articulating, especially if you're doing stuff on Zoom with your staff, right? Checking in. It made people articulate, here's what I'm excited about today. Oh, this thing is happening. And here's the thing I'm worried about today. The thorn, right, is like, oh, I've got these 17 Zoom calls back to back. But people would then have to say and articulate, here's, both the positive and the negative in their day. And I think that's been hard in coronavirus, right? Getting people to share, here's what I'm worried about. It's been hard for me, certainly, running our staff. So that was helpful. It also works in your family, I think, because people talk about, good and bad. And then you also kind of know who's having a rough day, right? Somebody who said, because we pretty quickly learned that people would start off with work stuff, but sometimes it would be, my rose is, my kid is fine, they got the coronavirus test back, oh, we're all good. And my thorn is, I'm a little nervous about my mom, right? All personal stuff, but that's the stuff that's affecting everybody. And I found it a very good way to get people to open up about things without saying, now could you open up and share some personal things with me? It was really helpful. And everyone had to go around, and sometimes it's funny, and sometimes it's silly, and often it's, oh, my thorn is this meeting. I don't want to be doing it. But it really, I think it made us connect to each other a little bit better. And I think in kids too, and you know who's saying, who is red flagging for you, I am having a rough day. And it might be a rough day because they're worried about something in their family. It might be a rough day because something in work is sucking them under. But as their boss, I am glad to know that. I know who needs to be treated with kid gloves today. I know who I need to check back in on multiple times during the day. I know who I can say, well then shoot, forget that thing I sent you to do. You have a rough day today. Why don't you just focus on that? Let me make it easier. That has been a really helpful exercise for us. And I would highly recommend it for people who are trying to keep a connection with a staff when everybody's remote, which is always very tricky.
I think that's wonderful advice, and the acknowledgement that sometimes there are things that are far more important than work in your life, and that you should tend to them is useful in treating people that way. This is the Inc. Vision Conference, and in that respect, people are here who have had a good 2020, a difficult 2020, are more hopeful for 2021, perhaps. What piece of advice in closing do you have for them? Where are we going to be next year?
I had a boss who told me once, after a very disastrous first live shot, there's opportunity in chaos. There's a lot of chaos in chaos, but there's opportunity in chaos. And I think entrepreneurs are very good at sussing that out, right? So you constantly have to go back down to, let me remove myself from the chaos in chaos, which we all know is there, and let's go back to, where is the opportunity here? Where is the opportunity? Whenever I find myself getting lost in the, oh my gosh, every one of our productions has been shut down, I go back to, all right, so pull up, where is the opportunity? And I think entrepreneurs are particularly good at this because we're forced to do this all the time, even when it's not a global pandemic. So it's just a matter of remembering, where's the opportunity? Make a list, start figuring it out, and keep yourself on track for opportunity and not getting sucked under into the chaos. That's it. That is my advice for 2020. And hopefully by mid-2021, and I really think it'll be mid-2021, we'll be coming out of it in terms of vaccines and real treatments, and hopefully through a second wave, et cetera, et cetera.
I hope you are right. I'm wishing with all my might that you're right, that we get there. That seems like a long way off, but it also seems soon. So I'm hopeful, even maybe a little optimistic. So thank you for that. Soledad O'Brien, host of Matter of Fact, prolific tweeter and entrepreneur at Soledad O'Brien Productions. Thanks so much for being at the Inc. Vision Conference.
Thank you for having me. Nice to chat.